Okay, so welcome everyone. Good afternoon on this splendid day here in Amsterdam at Spui 25. Also welcome to everyone who is following us online. I've been told that there are quite a lot of people there as well. My name is Laurien Vastenhout. I'm your moderator for today. I'm a researcher at the NIOD Institute for War, Holocaust and Genocide Studies here in Amsterdam, and I'm also a lecturer at the University of Amsterdam, and currently I'm a visiting researcher at the University of Vienna. Today we will be speaking about Sieg Maandag, trauma and art in the aftermath of Bergen-Belsen. We've put together a great panel for you. We have a full program today, so I'll just introduce all the speakers to you first. I'm standing here by the way, on behalf of the NIOD and the UvA, and I want to thank, of course, Spui 25 for allowing us to be here this afternoon. So the first speaker of today will be Dawn Skorczewski, who is also the co-organizer of this event. She's sitting here. She's senior lecturer at the Amsterdam University College and research professor of English emerita at Brandeis University. Together with Karen Maandag, Rolf, she published the book Sieg Maandag, Life and Art in the Aftermath of Bergen-Belsen in 2020, which is showing now. And in 2023, she edited a special issue for American Imago on the life and work of Sieg Maandag. And all the speakers who are here today contributed to that volume. Sitting here on my left directly is Christine Schmidt. She is Deputy Director and Head of Research at the Wiener Holocaust Library in London. She published extensively on the Holocaust and specifically on the post-war period, focusing on tracing and documentation efforts, gender, migration, and in the case of Sieg Maandag, on privilege and trauma. I must add that the Wiener Library currently has a very interesting exhibition on the history of Bergen-Belsen, and if you happen to be in London, you can still visit it until July 10th. The third speaker of today is Bettine Siertsma. She's Assistant Professor of History Emerita at the Vrije Universiteit here in Amsterdam. Her research focuses on international Holocaust literature and on oral testimonies of the Holocaust. She published extensively on the so-called Diamantkinderen, Diamond Children, which we will hear more about today. And last is Professor Dan Stone, Professor of Modern History at Royal Holloway, University of London. And he's the director of its Holocaust Research Institute. His research covers the history of fascism, genocide, and anthropology, focusing especially on the idea of race and theory of history. He is the author and or editor of 25 books and over 100 scholarly articles, including recently on Sieg Maandag and Holocaust art. So what we will do today is we will first hear 4 presentations by each of the person I've introduced so far, and then we will have a discussion, and there will also be room for questions and answers. So if you have any questions during one of the talks, just keep them until the end, and then you will have room to ask them. And at the very end, we will have some drinks together. Having said that, Dawn, I would like to invite you to come here.
It's such a pleasure to be here today. Thank you all for coming. It's really nice to be able to introduce you to Sieg Maandag, and also to talk to you about Sieg, if you already know who Sieg is and what his life and work were like. It's such an honor to be on a panel with these panelists. I'm really thrilled to be here with them too, and I'd like to thank them for their participation in an ongoing way in our exploration of Sieg's work. And also, thank you to those people who have joined us online. If there's any chance that my parents and sisters made it, I want to give them a special shout out. Thanks to Louis Kirshner for helping me with every aspect of my work on Sieg Maandag. I'd like to say that Simon Maandag, Sieg's son, is here with us today in the front row. I want to thank Simon for all of his help with the work that we've done on Sieg Maandag's story. And also, Simon's available to talk after the event if anyone's interested in speaking with him. I just want to tell you a little bit about who Sieg was, how we came to know about him, how I came to know about him, and hopefully how I learned to use a microphone. Oh, good. Okay, good. So this is the name of the book, which I made this book with Karen Maandag, who is Sieg's wife. I came to meet Karen because Bettina and I were doing research on the Diamond Children of Amsterdam, and Sieg was one of those children. You'll hear more about that soon. And Karen happened to be from the town in upstate New York, or nearby, where I was from. And because she was not really eager to talk to people about Sieg's work, I said to her, oh, by the way, I'm from that town. And she said, oh, then come over. And the next thing we knew, we were making a book together. And the saddest part of the presentation is that a couple of years after we finished our work together, Karen died, actually sooner than that. So this event is also in memory of her, of Karen Maandag, and it was such a pleasure to work with her on this project. You see Sieg here in his studio, you see one of his paintings, you see a Ziggy, he called himself Ziggy sometimes, late in life photo. He was born in 1937 here in Amsterdam, and his dad Isaac is on the right-hand side of the screen there, and there is Sieg and his sister Henneke and his mom Kitty. There's a little bit of history on this slide, and it's the only slide that looks like this. Most of you know this story, which is that in May 10th, 1940, when Sieg was 3 years old, the Nazis invaded the Netherlands. Sieg's dad, Isaac, was only 30 years old at that point. He was a diamond dealer, and he was also eventually in the Jewish Council. So as a result of his position, and Christine will be talking more about this, Sieg was allowed to stay with his family in Amsterdam a bit longer than a lot of the Jewish people who are being deported from here. So as a result of that, what they called the Diamond Speer, the family was not deported until May 6, 1943, when they were sent to Westerbork. They then went on to Bergen-Belsen in February of 44. And perhaps the worst event of Sieg's life happened in Bergen-Belsen months later, when the Diamond Jewish population in Bergen-Belsen was separated. The men were sent to one concentration camp, the women to another, and the children were left in Bergen-Belsen, probably to be killed by this man who was driving them around, but he didn't end up killing them, and they survived together as a group. Bettina will tell you more about that. Sieg was in that group, of course, and so was his sister. He survived with about 50 other Jewish children. On April 15th, Bergen-Belsen was liberated. At the liberation, or a bit later, George Rodger, a British photographer, photographed Sieg. And this photograph is the original photograph. It's a horrific trigger warning type photograph. Don't look too closely if you don't want to see, because what you see here is what we now know, a bunch of Dutch women lying down, mostly dead bodies, mostly Dutch dead bodies, and most of them don't have much clothing on, and they're also, some of them, covered with feces. You see Sieg in relatively normal-looking clothing. When this photo was published in Life magazine, some people thought that he was a German child and that he was sort of a witness to what they had done. The truth is, he had just gotten those clothes from a barracks behind the photo, back in the back of the photo. He was allowed to choose his own clothing. He remembered choosing very carefully. He was really proud of his outfit. He also, you see his eyes averted, his face averted. You can see, how many of you have seen this photo in the Holocaust? Yes, in the Holocaust Museum. So most of you have. So you know as well as I do what I experienced again today, because I decided to go over there before, just earlier this afternoon, as a kind of just way to check in with the photo and his painting that's there, and to remember Karen and our work together. And when I went, I was struck yet again by the fact that the photo is so shocking. It's so shocking. But also, I was noticing how he is at once looking away from the bodies and at the photographer. And this gaze, forward and away, is something that I'm going to talk a little bit about. Get a little bit better of a look at him here. Someone did this online, and I thought it was good. There are different versions of the photo. The one I just showed you was not published as such in Life magazine because it was touched up a little bit, or cut there. But we won't talk too much about that now. So there are two concepts that I work with when I think about Sieg. And one of them is the idea that a scholar called Lawrence Langer has, that survivors of the Holocaust died in the camps and then lived on, so that in the aftermath, they have to deal with this fact of being dead and alive simultaneously. There's a psychoanalyst, many of you probably are familiar with, Sandra Ferenczi, who talks about a different kind of phenomenon. He was originally talking about children who are sexually abused. And what he says about those children is that the aggressor and the victim both live inside the child's internal world. So the child isn't the aggressor, but the aggressor is inside the child as well as the child victim. So those two ideas are ideas I play with a lot when I talk at length about the work. If they don't mean anything to you right now, that doesn't matter. We can still understand Sieg. This book is made of Sieg's testimony, which was given to the Shoah Foundation in Dutch. And what the book consists of is a bunch of quotes from the testimony in Dutch and also translated into English. And then I went through all of his work, which Karen and I looked at together, and paired the testimony with images. So they weren't intended to go together, but I kind of felt my way into it. There are some pretty, heavy-hitting scholars on this panel. I'm not one of them. I'm not that kind of scholar. I'm a creative scholar, and I work like with poetry and images and testimony, and I put it all together, and I see what I see. And then these people will help you contextualize it at a deeper level. So what this combo is a plate and a discussion of his life in Amsterdam. And basically what he says is, I was a very privileged boy. My mother didn't work. I had a little sister. We lived on a wide avenue with beautiful trees in an upstairs apartment with, I remember, a lot of luxury. Everything was there. I lacked nothing. I picked this photo. You'll notice that there's a part of the face that's dark. This is a theme in Sieg's work. I think of that part of his work, that blackened face, as a kind of memorial to what happened to him, a fact that it's still with him, and a kind of recognition that he can deal with that and move forward through art, right? And move on, keep going. Okay, so they went to the Schouwburg. They were taken there before they were taken to Westerbork. And basically what he says about that place is his dad got hit there. It's the first time he witnessed his father being humiliated in public. He immediately got a blow. Something happened to me. What it was, I do not know. I dare not call it fear because it was something else, embarrassment. We were there hours. I mean, in the dark. It all happened in the dark, in my thinking. Maybe you notice when I read, and it's the English version, of course. Many of you know, most of you probably speak Dutch, and you can read the Dutch version, which is probably even more eloquent. But I think of Sieg as speaking very eloquently about his experience, that it lived in him, and he could tell the story to his listeners, and he was very aware of his audience. Just as he was aware of George Rodger taking his picture in Bergen-Belsen, he was aware of people hearing him talk about what happened to him. My father, who was a diamond merchant, suddenly had to work in the kitchen, and I saw him walking with big cans of milk on his back. The man had never done that in his life. This is in Westerbork. And he came back into the barracks from the kitchen and something seemed wrong. That is not how he was brought up. I mean, it's not bad to lift a crate of milk or a milk can. I do things like that every day. But he could not. And I saw him suffering. He went under it. I did not feel that way with my mother. She was apparently stronger. This picture is like a St. Christopher painting to me, that image. That's Sieg's face. Notice you see the mark, right? Sometimes I won't tell you what I think about the image. I'm just going to show you. I paired this comment with this image. I think of it as being about his grandmother. I love this painting. Look, everyone was trying to stay in Westerbork. That was still the Netherlands, flat, not too far from home. But then, I mean, from there you went to Auschwitz or Bergen-Belsen, and everyone knew that. But that was accompanied by fear, and my grandmother left the camp, and that was very emotional for my mother to see her mother go. And the elderly, they have not returned. My mother cried when she saw her mother leave, so I was deeply affected by it. I did not cry, but that was because it was also a woman's thing to do. So his grandmother died in Sobibor, was murdered in Sobibor. I shouldn't touch that. And this image does not have that same kind of shadow on it. I don't find that in most of the images of women that Sieg paints. This is about going to Bergen-Belsen on the train, and you're going to hear about that in Bettina's lecture, so I'm not going to say much about it, except that he told his father to stop crying, and his father said, this child is telling me not to cry. What's happening here? Now we're in Bergen-Belsen. We got up early. That was accompanied by noise, and then we had to appear on Appel. that was a torment, because between those hundreds, if there were no more than 100 people, sometimes they missed people, or people were sick, and that could take hours. That was very bad. Children who were sick, or the count was not right. It was also a game for the Germans. Let it be said that they were bullying us. Bullying was a thing. I mean, later I knew that it was bullying. The numbers were not right. That makes sense. So that's why it takes so long. I thought that at the time, but now I have read so much literature about it. It was clearly bullying. So this relationship between who Sieg is now when he's talking and giving testimony, and who he was back there in the camp and what he experienced, this present and past simultaneously all the time, I see this in the images and also in his testimony. You know about trauma, right? That trauma can freeze the past. In Toni Morrison's book, Song of Solomon, I think of this as the iconic image of trauma. Her character, Milkman, is always facing behind him when he's riding in the car with his parents. So he can't turn around and look at the future because he's fixated on the past. I don't see that with Sieg. I see simultaneously, there's the past, and here we try to move into the present. Here's where his father's taken away from him. He says, "It was horrible. I can only present the image. My father and all those men stood there. They had put on their best suits. They stood at the Appell, and they said goodbye." There's a book, Between Two Streams, which many of you know, by Abel Herzberg. He writes about Bergen-Belsen that this scene of the parents being separated from the children was what he thought of as the worst thing that happened that he saw in Bergen-Belsen. And that was it. We felt abandoned. First my father, then my mother. That was a huge loneliness. Sister Luba was a Polish woman who was discharged from Auschwitz to Bergen-Belsen, and she came into contact with us children, the leftover children, and she took care of the children. She did that. That turns out to be a miracle, because she loved us with bits and pieces, begging the Germans, and she managed to keep asking for food for the children. That was something beautiful, yes. She was our mainstay. You could go to her. There were children who walked along holding her skirts. I was too big. I would also like to lean against her. I just didn't. Yes, a surrogate mother, yes. This is a picture of a family friend. Simon, you know who it is. In a minute, I'm going to show you the picture on the back of it. This is about the corpses piled up. And I put it with, Sieg was not in any way a Christian, but he does have some Christian images in his work. And I put this comment about the corpses with that image. This is my favorite image, and you know it because it's on the cover. It's Sieg with his wife, Karen. He met her long after he left the camp. But I associate it with this, what he said about his mom. I often thought of my mother in my dreams at night. I missed her the most and woke up at night crying. I was in pain, not really crying, but in pain with desire. I just thought that was so beautifully said, and this concept of desire and where his desire came from and how it happened that Karen met him. She knew he was traumatized pretty soon after they had fallen fairly madly in love, but she made a conscious decision, I'm going to be with this man, despite the fact that he has had this experience, or maybe partially because of that. And they were together happily, one of those big loves their whole lives. He died of a dementia-related disease in 2013, and as I said, Karen died 2 years ago. So he's united with his mother. How? This is the kind of amazing thing. The photograph appears in Life magazine. Sieg at the time is in a hospital in Amsterdam, over by the Rijksmuseum, where he ended up living. So he has typhus, and he's emaciated. His sister is elsewhere. His mom was told by the Red Cross that her children were dead. So she kind of thought they're not dead, but she had no evidence. Suddenly she goes to their post office box at the Diamond Building, and this picture from Life magazine is in her box. An uncle in New York had seen the photo, and he said, "That's my nephew." And so he sends a few copies of Life magazine to Amsterdam. And that's how they're reunited, because Sieg's mom goes to the Red Cross and says, "He's alive. My son is alive." And that's how they get reunited at the hospital. There's actually a really pretty photo, beautiful photo of their reunion. It's in the book. Yeah. So then there are a lot of people, including Dan Stone, who say that Sieg's agony only began at liberation, right? Because he's 7 years old when he leaves the camp. He's suffering from nightmares. He's suffering from, he's a big-ish kid with little kids because he missed 2 years of school or 3 years of school. And they moved to Zaandam, and the people there in the film that's made about this story, which is by Franz Bromet, they said that he would have such loud nightmares and screaming in the night that the whole town knew about this traumatized child who was living among them. The person in the film who talks about it, unfortunately, seems a little irritated, but it was an unpleasant situation in general. He did not have an easy time. He did end up seeking out some mental help. I think that when he found art, that's when he really started to find a way to manage, and also love. You know what Freud says, love and work, right? Well, Sieg found Karen, and then he started painting, and then he was able to manage a life. And along came Simon and his sister, Sarah, too. So he left to go traveling in 1970 after trying to be a diamond cutter and a businessman, and then he meets Karen in Afghanistan in 74, and they return to Amsterdam in 76. There was this very strange thing, which is in 74, he's in a bus accident, and he knew the driver of the bus looked drunk or somehow ill, so he decided to sit in the part of the bus that he thought would be best to be sitting in if there would be a crash. And there was a crash, and everyone on the bus died except Sieg. So this was a second kind of trauma for him, right? But I think also maybe he felt that he had been chosen for this. Like this, okay, so I survived, and that's when he started painting, right? I'm not going to do that. This painting makes me think of the aggressor and the victim inside the internal world. But nothing makes me think of that more than this unfinished painting, which is on the back of a painting of the woman that I showed you earlier. And this is something that Karen and I sort of discovered together. I think she already knew it was there but had forgotten. And we were just walking around her living room looking at paintings, and we turned this around. I was trying to find the date, and there's this painting on the back of it. And so the way I see this painting, the aggressor is right there on the left-hand side. He is feeding distorted mental images to a child with an open mouth, and the child's head is getting distorted in relation to that, right? So the child has a distorted subjectivity, a distorted sense, in an internal world that is chaotic and absurd, potentially, as a result of this. So he's being fed poison, and this is what happens to him. That's how I see it. Dan has written about this painting, too, and he has a slightly different way of talking about it, which I hope he talks about today. So, I love this painting too, and it's huge. It's so beautiful. There isn't anything else to paint but faces. I see them as a reflection of my own face. Perhaps it is a constant search for myself. Out of the crowds in a city, faces come to me and interact with my own. I have 1 minute left? Okay. Sieg went through a very dark period. This is a sculpture. He made several versions of it. It's called The Warrior. And Karen told me that the idea is that there's always a light. No matter how dark it is, that Sieg believed there's always some light. And that's what this sculpture is about. When he got dementia, he started making more and more pottery. Here's some examples. Again, a search for the faces in the crowd. A search for my original face, my face as a boy. And there's the little family in 1981. As we finish, I just want to tell you two things. You saw that I was obsessed with this idea of the face representing both the trauma and the effort to overcome it through art and creativity. So I want to read you this quote. It's by Dan Stone, actually. Simple. He says, history is unavoidably a poetic act. So I just told you a kind of history of Sieg Maandag. You'll hear a lot more about him in the moments to come, but it's a kind of poetic act, right? We're putting together a lot of different pieces, and you'll hear a lot of different versions of this history as we move forward here. But it's 80 years after Sieg was liberated from Bergen-Belsen, and that's partially why you're all here today, right? And I wanted to say to you what I thought Sieg says in his artist statements, which is, I mark it here on my face on the side that was closest to the piles of bodies in the Photo and Life magazine. I lived in that place and through that horror, and the women in the piles of bodies on that side did not live. My father did not live, and my grandmother did not live. My mother and my sister and I survived. It is a dark history, and it is part of me. I carry it with me in my body, and paradoxically, I search for it too. The boy I was before I had this mark, this trauma. I search for it in my art. I will never find that boy, but I will never be able to stop looking for him either. I will always be looking back and forward at the same time. My art is a testimony to survival and to suffering. Thanks.
that's a tough act to follow. Is that good? Good. Oh. That's okay. While you do that. Okay. Yeah, that is a tough act to follow. Thank you, everybody, for coming, both of everyone here and online. And I wanted to thank Dawn, of course, for bringing us all together in Sieg and Karen's memory. It's been such a great honor to explore his life and work over the last several years. I think Dawn has given us just a brief encapsulation of what a fascinating person he was. And of course, I also wanted to thank Laureen and our hosts here for organizing today. So I'm going to pick up a bit where Dawn has left off and amplify, I think, some of the themes that she's already raised about Sieg's biography, in particular about how his life and art illuminate a powerful and complex intersection between privilege. You see that she raised this quotation already that from Sieg himself, and trauma during the Holocaust. So perhaps for obvious reasons, I'm going to be putting privilege in quotation marks. I may not do this every single time, but please note that I understand this is a loaded and very complex and difficult term, but I may not say that explicitly each time. But I'm going to explain that a bit more now. And also, this is the only slide that looks like this, so please don't get worried. I want to begin with a quote from the well-known Dutch Jewish writer and Belsen survivor Abel Herzberg. Here he was describing the transition of the Bergen-Belsen camp, where, as Dawn mentioned, and Bettina, I think we'll discuss very soon, Sieg was deported as a child from a so-called Vorzugslager, which was a camp for privileged prisoners, to an Aufenthaltslager, which means a detention camp. Underlining the ultimate futility of privileged treatment by the Nazis and their collaborators, Herzberg wrote in his book Amor Fati, Bergen-Belsen had significant advantages, of which the most important was that families were not wrenched asunder. That only happened when the top leaders in Berlin had decided that a particular group no longer qualified for Vorzugsbehandlung, or privileged treatment. At such times, a so-called bad transport would depart, and those who worked outside the camp could see how men and women had to go in different directions, to an unknown and unimaginable destination from which they would not return. On these occasions, they could also witness the elevating sight of mothers giving their children a parting kiss. Those were more or less the subtleties of German idealism. So at first glance, it might seem paradoxical to use the word privilege in the context of concentration camps, but Sieg's experience shows how temporary, fragile advantages, such as being part of this so-called diamond group of skilled Jewish workers who were temporarily spared deportation, and then some of the harsher features of the Bergen-Belsen camp, at least for a time, could offer small chances of survival, even while exposing families to unimaginable and long-endured horrors. The social standing that positioned the Maandag family as privileged, that helped give Sieg a chance to survive, and that ushered in the vehicle through which he eventually grappled with his experiences through art, resulted also, as we heard, in the death of his father. Sieg's art later demonstrated an attempt to develop a language of self-expression related to his own experiences, including his sense of privilege, which he assimilated into his visual and other narratives of survival, which Dawn has quoted some from so beautifully, and which I also will take a few examples as well. So, as Dawn noted, Sieg was just 7 years old when he was liberated from Bergen-Belsen. His family had belonged to Amsterdam's so-called diamond Jews, skilled workers who were deemed valuable by the Nazis, initially sparing them from immediate deportation. Sieg's father was a diamond merchant, and prior to World War II, as Dawn had noted, they lived in a beautiful, wonderful flat in a beautiful neighborhood in Amsterdam. And although social class was by far not the only factor determining survival, in some cases, Jews who managed to access resources and networks were able to respond with more alacrity to unfolding persecution and the increasingly radicalized measures taken against them. Moreover, anti-Semitic notions of Jewish wealth and networks overlapped with partial class-based survival strategies at different moments in the history of Nazi persecution of the Jews. So the so-called diamond Jews were spared a series of roundups and deportations, only to be carried off to Westerbork transit camp in 1943 and 1944 to be held captive by the Nazis in order to resurrect the diamond industry in Vught and Bergen-Belsen, which never materialized. Prior to their deportation, they tried to spare themselves and their families, seeking the correct stamps and documentation to escape initial roundups, and their determinations of how best to respond to the shifting genocidal policies as they encountered them were filtered through Jewish councils, through their contacts and others in positions of social influence, and were, of course, highly variable and capricious. So it was expedient for the Germans to spare different groups of Jews based on their view of the so-called interconnectedness of the Jewish population and the spurious idea that Jews had unlimited access to wealth and resources. And this, too, propelled their decision about those deemed worthy of so-called exchange with foreign entities in the waning days of the war. And if in the discussion you're interested, we can talk a little bit about the creation of my own home institution, which is based in part on one of those exchange deportations. The Nazis and their collaborators persecuted the spared population incrementally in order to prevent skilled workers from fleeing, trading diamonds on the black market, or going into hiding. And Jewish victims thus had struggled to navigate all of this as the rules of so-called privilege shifted. And for a time, the Maandag's privilege status, of course, protected them. They remained together when many Jewish families were torn apart. But privilege was relative and cruelly fleeting, wrapping its victims in periods of alternating and simultaneous expectation, uncertainty, waiting, hope, and fear. In Bergen-Belsen, even the protected endured starvation, disease, and brutality. Holocaust scholars have long struggled with how to talk about privilege among victims without passing judgment, although more recent work, for example, by Lauren, and as well as someone named Adam Brown, including other populations that experienced hierarchies of privilege, such as those in so-called mixed marriages, those in positions of authority, such as the Jewish councils, are changing this narrative, and we're having a closer look at this complexity. Sieg's experiences remind us that privilege during the Holocaust was often an illusory temporary reprieve. In her analysis of child Holocaust survivors, Judith Kestenberg observed that, quote, out of the ashes of the Holocaust, there arose a widespread creativity. Many child survivors became painters, sculptors, writers, and poets. Sieg thus joined other surviving children who turned to art in the aftermath to find a language of expression. His canvases became his voice, a way to express what words might not. While the subject matter of Sieg's artistic output ranged from still life, as Don showed portraits of his wife and children, to surreal landscapes, to untitled or unnamed portraits of musicians and other human figures, his output can be seen as representative of the contours of the emotional terrain of his experiences before, during, and after the Holocaust. This includes the traumatic separation from his parents and the hunger and brutality he witnessed. I think these were assimilated with the later knowledge of the privileged status of his family, which resulted in uncertainty, dashed expectations, tremendous fear, and ultimately loss. The tendency toward illusion and the act of creation itself thus served as a means for transforming the traumatic experiences of his childhood. So I want to talk a little bit more about a few examples, just three, from his prolific body of work. And I'm also not an art historian, so I'm kind of doing something that I'm not totally comfortable doing, but that was the assignment from Dawn. So it's been really really rewarding to be able to look at his art this way. In his testimony, Sieg recalled the velvet-padded train compartments that took them from Westerbork to Bergen-Belsen. This was a small comfort compared to the cattle cars many other Jews endured during deportation. And later, after assimilating new knowledge, he would recognize that this was a grotesque anomaly. This is echoed in his work Reincarnation Movement series from 1995. The vibrant colors at the center of the canvas emerge from and are partially distorted by darker hues, suggesting a kind of suffocation or transformation. And I think Sieg discusses this transformative inversion of the parental role between himself and his father. And I think Dawn already alluded to this. Noting his father was crying, and upon comforting him, he remembered that his father said, "Look what they're saying now, the children. These are not children anymore." The work here demonstrates both movement and transformation, and the physical act of creation, particularly because this is rendered in oil. Sieg noted that oil led to, quote, greater self-development as a painter, and that through abstraction, a figurative canvas emerges through the combination of wet brushstrokes, the brushstrokes being more important than the result. The second example is another crucial moment, I think, in Sieg's experience, the point of permanent separation from his father, who was deported from Bergen-Belsen first, later to be followed by his mother. An experience ubiquitously described in child survivors' testimonies as profoundly traumatic and a cataclysmic break with childhood as they understood it. He describes the picture of the roundup of the men of the Diamond Group who were deported from Bergen-Belsen in early December 1944, recalling that they had put on their best suits, they even looked chic. In my memory, some of them even had tuxedos on, walking upright as they went to the train. I don't know if it was a train. It could have also been a car with a cover over it, an old-fashioned car. Something like that was the picture. And that was emotional, very emotional. It was terrible, really, very painful. And I go back again to Albo Hertzberg's diary entry for December 4, where he describes the same scene as heartrending, indicating that with the deportation of the Diamond Group, their hope in the protection provided by the lists of the so-called privileged had now collapsed. The interviewer asks Sieg if he knew what had happened to his father, and Sieg sort of demurs in the interview and suggests that he had later learned something of his fate but would rather not talk about it. But then he poses another seemingly unanswerable question. Can you imagine saying goodbye to your father? His artistic output suggests that he wants others to imagine this moment, even if the question elicits no satisfactory response. And although there is no literal representation of the separation from his parents in his work, one might find the outlines of a language for expression of the trauma in order to depict the pictures of what he described and what he experienced in a group of paintings. And some of these you can see in the book in the back, The Beautiful Shirt, Night Scene, Aggression, and Life's Banquet. And I've just shown one here, Aggression. Sieg noted that, quote, I can only give you an image, implying both the burden he felt to verbalize what had happened, but also a retention of some control over the vehicle of how he would express or represent that moment. Aggression, a surreal, muted landscape with a dark horizon line and waning light, marred by threatening, penetrative shapes, descending from a dark, bleak sky, suggests a foreboding of danger and destruction. So Sieg's paintings, or our last one, and ceramics are often full of faces, as Dawn mentioned, distorted, anguished, sometimes joyful, sometimes grotesque. They reflect both the horrors he witnessed and the hope he seemed to struggle to retain. Some faces are melting, hollow-eyed, or splintered, visual echoes of trauma. Others hint at vitality and resilience. These elusive emotional landscapes invite viewers to imagine, and I think to feel, the psychological realities Sieg could not easily describe. In this 1983 self-portrait, he depicted himself in oil, again, with a swirling, rather combative, intense gaze and a speech bubble left blank. I think it's a pretty haunting image of the struggle to articulate an inarticulable past. As psychoanalyst Anna Ornstein has noted, art by survivors is often, quote, a transformation of memory. It preserves and transmits trauma not through direct storytelling, but through emotion, imagination, and beauty. Sieg's work fits this pattern. It invites active engagement. It demands viewers fill in the blanks with their own emotions. And paradoxically, one of the means through which Sieg's family survived their so-called privileged status, which dictated their fates, locating them in Westerbork first and then temporarily in Bergen-Belsen, and which also led to his father's death, created this possibility for this language to develop, his chance to create a career for himself as a professional artist, a life trajectory that may not have necessarily been available to others. Ornstein also found that, quote, any and all forms of art that resonated with any aspect of young survivors' own emotional states were psychological lifesavers, end quote. Sieg himself noted that painting acts as a support for the climb upwards. And although this doesn't necessarily mean that art was a psychological lifesaver for him, rather, to me, it signifies that art, a means accessible to him, supported his struggle to formulate a language of self-expression. The record of Sieg's experiences and the rendering of his transformed memories are invaluable evidence of the intersection of privilege and trauma of a child who survived the Holocaust. Thank you.
terug. Okay. So first, I'd like to thank Doreen and Don for bringing us together, first in the journal Imago, and now in this live event. I'm very honored to be in your company, all four of you. My part of the story, and it will have some repetition, which is unavoidable, I think, when four people talk about the same story. But my part of the story starts on December 5th in 1944, when first the men, then the women of the Diamond Group in Bergen-Belsen were deported to Sachsenhausen and Beendorf. The children were left to their fate. Among them Sieg Maandag, 7 years old. The group of around 50 children, aged from 18 months to 14 years, would certainly have perished had not a young Polish woman, Luba Trzyzinska, taken pity on them. You see her here. Luba was a Jewish prisoner who had first been to Auschwitz and had lost her husband and 3-year-old child there. Having nothing to lose anymore, she summoned up great courage to the point of recklessness, perhaps. And this, combined with her ingenuity, enabled her to save the group of almost 50 children. Except for one baby and one older girl, all the children survived these last terrible months of Bergen-Belsen, despite the typhoid and diphtheria that raged in the camp, and despite the ever-worsening lack of food. Because they were so young during the war, relatively many could give testimony to the Shoah Foundation in the mid-1990s. I collected their stories in a kind of group biography, even in an English version as well. To have a better understanding of what Sieg and the other children went through, I'll zoom in on some details of his and one other boy's testimony. And here a trigger warning is in place as well. There's some gruesome details in there, in the quotes that I've chosen. But they are to show you that this story of 50 children, almost 50 children who had been saved, gives the risk of giving a too rosy idea of how it was in Bergen-Belsen. So these quotes are a sort of counterweight to that risk. Sieg, as a boy, had lively memories of their arrival in Bergen-Belsen. Upon leaving the train, he says, and on the right-hand side is the original Dutch, and to the left is the English translation of the quotes. Upon leaving the train, the most horrible scenes played out. People who were too slow in getting out of the train, pregnant women threatened by dogs. We were standing on the platform, barking, biting dogs, and people who huddled together in agony. That is my image. Yelling Germans. You get a picture. 7 months later, as you already heard, his father was deported to an then unknown destination. Sieg remembers how the men had to say goodbye to their wives and children on the Appelplatz, how they were dressed in their best suits and that they walked very upright to the trucks that took them away from their families. And that was emotional, he says. That was very emotional, very emotional. Yes, that was terrible, really, very painful, as if words are lacking him to describe what went through him and, as he supposes, went through his father. He never saw his father again. Next day, his mother was taken away. After some cold, lonely, and hungry hours, the little ones crying and the older children trying in vain to comfort them, Sister Luba appeared on the scene, almost miraculously and took care of them. For them, Luba became a surrogate mother. Maybe you remember the quote that Dawn told you, that the little children clung to her skirt and that he was jealous of them, that he wanted to do that too, but he felt too old for that. One of the older boys of the group was Gerrit Cohentius. No, I'm skipping a page. Dawn also already told you how the children were regularly confronted with half-dead people, begging even the children for food. So little Sieg was well aware of what was going on in the camp and what hunger did to people. One day he witnessed a man who did not conform to the general attitude of fighting for the little food that could be found. That day, wandering around in the camp, he came across a barrel with some last food scraps and men crawling around it, pushing and punching to try and get hold of the last scraps. But a meter, he says, a meter and a half distance, there was one man with a smile on his lips and his bowl in front of him, waiting till he could get the very last scraps from that barrel. But there he was, waiting quietly for his turn. He didn't join the fighting. And that, I thought, our dear Lord for a moment in the camp. That was astounding, breathtaking. He uses in Dutch Onze lieve Heer, for our dear Lord. That a little Jewish boy saw in that man for a moment Jesus Christ, may be a foreshadowing of his open attitude and susceptibility as an adult towards other religions. Apart from the appalling food situation, the housing wasn't exactly comfortable either. Death, understatement, death was also present inside the children's barrack. The next quote from Sieg's testimony is, I assume, from the last weeks of the overcrowded camp, when children from Poland and Russia were housed with the Dutch group. It stank. And there were, we were sleeping with two people to a bed. We had those bunk beds again. And there was a boy next to me, and we weren't really fighting, but we were kind of bickering. He stretched his feet towards my face, and I stretched mine towards his. That's how we had to lie with each other in that camp. So you didn't really get any rest. The bed bugs were on the frames of the really big fat bed bugs. It was terrible. It stank like I don't know what. And one day I felt how the man who was with me in the bed was dead. So suddenly I knew I've got more space now. With my foot I could give him a little push. Or how did people live at that time? I gave him a little push and he clashed from the bed. I could sleep. Finally, I could sleep. Sister Luba was helped by some other women, especially her Czech friend Hermina, whom she met in Auschwitz. But also by the older children, as much as they could. Hetty Werkendam, the eldest girl, took care of the toddlers. I'm going too fast. No, sorry. This is Hetty. She took care of the toddlers. One of them, Robbie Englander, born in 1941. This is him. still has fond memories of her and kept contact as long as she lived. She passed away last year, aged 94. Her memoirs about the camp are widely read. The Children's House of Belsen is one of the titles. One of the older boys of the group was Gerrit Cogentius, 6 years older than Sieg. You see him here at the time of the interview. As a 13-year-old boy, he took care of his baby cousin, Gerry. Remarkably, his memories are that Luba appeared in his life only after the liberation. Perhaps that is because he was so preoccupied with the care of Gerry. They slept together in one bed, while the child was not yet toilet trained. Note in the next quote the repetitive, "I had to," indicating the burden this all was to the 13-year-old boy. And again, a trigger warning is in place here. I had to feed him, and I had to clean him as best as possible. I had no diapers. I had some kind of pants. I had to wash them in cold water. I had to do all that. And I had to do something very special. As a baby, he was so malnourished in the long run. I remember that if he had to push, als hij naar de wc moest persen, then his intestines would come out. I soon realized what I had to do. I sat like this, he gestured at his lap, while with the child lying on my lap, his legs up, on his stomach. But because he was so malnourished, his intestines came out. Then I pressed his bottom together, like this, and then I pressed those intestines back in with my thumbs. And after a few hours, when he had to push again, he was again lying there. And then all those intestines came out again due to malnutrition. I see it in my mind's eyes, right there. In those last months, food had become so scarce that all normal standards lost their validity. Several children, including Gerrit, report that they witnessed more than once how emaciated prisoners cut pieces of meat from the corpses scattered everywhere to eat it raw. Gerrit tells very graphically about it. Then he comments, "If one slides down into such a situation as over there, then a person degenerates. Then you become completely numb. All you think about is your own survival. And whether another person dies, you don't care. That's of no interest to you. Yes, your loved ones, of course, like the children I was with, and Gerry." The liberation days proved to be no less traumatizing in some respects. Gerrit relates how one of the Dutch soldiers in the British Army thought he would give him a nice treat. I can still see myself frisking along that big guy in a uniform and all. And then we walked somewhere, and I see a sort of shed, and in it an SS man. They had locked him up. He was in a shed. And he opens the shed, and I still have that image in my mind, and he takes his gun from his holster, and he shoots him dead, just like that. And he says, "Well, that's done." He thought I might be pleased with that. There might be an explanation for the fact that in his memory, another explanation than the care for Gerry, for the fact that in his memory, Luba only appears after the liberation. She kept a very strict regime as for food. Now that food was suddenly available, the children wanted to devour as much as possible, but their bodies would certainly not be up to that. Luba allowed them to eat only small portions at a time. And obviously that wise policy was not appreciated at the time. but Gerrit valued it afterwards. And when we were liberated in the end, he says, then suddenly there were these two nurses, Nurse Luba and Nurse Hermina, and they, I don't know how exactly, but they took care of us. There was some food, obviously. The English had brought that with them. But of course, that was also the great thing about Nurse Luba and Nurse Hermine, who rationed us very strictly. Because if you go from, well, almost dead to suddenly overeating, then you die. So they knew exactly, boys, so far and no further. Eh? So that was very good. But at the time, I hear from other testimonies too, the boys didn't appreciate that. For now, I leave aside the return, the adjustment problems, the difficult relationships with surviving parents, the sad financial and material circumstances. For Sieg Maandag, Gerrit Cohentius and the toddler Robbie Engelander. The children had survived, if just barely, but it was hardly ever a simple, joyful, happy ending for them, nor for their mothers. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay. I also would just like to say thank you to everybody for coming, and thank you to Dawn and Laureen for organising this event. It's a great pleasure to be here, especially in such beautiful weather. My job as the final speaker is to say something about Sieg as a Holocaust artist, and to say I'm going to talk a little bit about Holocaust art in general, and then say something. All of us, I think, we've interpreted his work and as somehow related to his life. But as you'll see, what's interesting, I think, about Sieg Maandag's oeuvre is that he doesn't look like a Holocaust artist. I mean, his work doesn't look like the work of a Holocaust artist. And that, I think, is what makes the discussion here a bit more interesting than if we were talking about somebody who obviously was. And so that's what I'm going to do in this particular talk. Let's see. Okay. That's not one of Sieg's works. That's courtesy of Microsoft or something. Okay. According to the... I should also add, although I hate people who apologise at the start of lectures, but I tell my students off for doing this, but I'm also not an art historian, I'm not an expert on Holocaust art, but the temptation, I think, thanks to Dawn and Bettina's and Karen's work a few years ago, the temptation to think about Sieg and his work in the context of the history of the Holocaust and the representations of the Holocaust was too great for me. And so I, despite my lack of expertise, I thought, okay, I'm going to do this anyway because it's so interesting. There is, I think, according to the scholar of Holocaust art, Sarah Gendron, there are two ways in which Holocaust art tends to be made. The first is abstraction, pure abstraction, and the second is ultra-realism. And those are, I think, she argues, particularly in government-sponsored institutions, museums, and so on, these are the two main ways in which Holocaust art is usually presented to the public. And she says that the appeal, obviously, of abstraction is that it somehow suggests a kind of profundity or of gravitas without having to engage directly with the horror of the thing it's talking about. And so we're all now, I think, quite familiar with minimalism in art and minimalism in memorials and architecture as being I suppose, the archetypal way in which Holocaust art and Holocaust memory is now depicted. If you think of I suppose from Maya Lin's Vietnam War Memorial onwards, through to the work of Daniel Libeskind and others, the idea of modernist, of minimalist architecture and memorials, i.e. showing nothing as a way of showing something, has become very powerful and has become, I suppose, almost a kind of cliche. And I think over time we've become far too used to this sort of abstraction. So I think we can all think of paintings of almost nothing that you can give it a title like Sobibor. Suddenly it takes on a tremendous profundity, and you think, well, really, what's going on there? The appeal, obviously, of realism is the opposite one, which is to say that it has a kind of educational or I suppose journalistic kind of quality to make the viewer think that he or she has been there and has fulfilled their duty of understanding something of what happened in the context of the Holocaust. The objections to these, I think, are also interesting. The objection to figurative art is that, as Janet Wolff puts it, that it attracts the viewer to the pornography of violence, repelling the viewer with the gratuitous nature of the representation, alienating the viewer in a way that they can't really respond empathetically, or offending the viewer even by breaking taboos on representing certain things. For example, representing the inside of gas chambers. This is something that some artists have done and others refuse to do so. The same argument has taken place in the context of film of the Holocaust as well. Her own objection, Wolff, argues that realist art, she puts it, performs a premature movement of closure, enticing the viewer to accept the belief that he or she has now seen the object, the event, the moment, the Holocaust itself. In other words, there's no sense, if in a realist painting, a bit like a realist text, a traditional historian's text, for example, there's no suggestion of the construction of the thing. It's meant as a window onto the past itself. And you have this is the illusion of reality. And this in itself is somewhat problematic. My basic point, I think, here is to say, actually, when you look at the canon of Holocaust artists, most of them don't fall easily into either of these two categories anyway. And so a lot of the debate about what constitutes Holocaust art is to some extent negated, particularly by, I suppose, what we would call the really great, the canon of Holocaust art. And I just want to give a few examples depicting some from more or less, almost all of them figurative, some of them, I suppose, veering more towards abstraction, some veering more towards realism. But all of them, I think, recognizably what we would call Holocaust art. And I think we can talk afterwards, particularly when I contrast these with what Sieg Maandag did. We can think about what Holocaust art really actually means. So this first one, many of these will be familiar to people here, I'm sure. Gerhard Richter's painting, Uncle Rudy, is one of his photorealist paintings. There are others in the series, rather different, but one of my favorites is a painting of a toilet roll, which is by Richter, which is so extraordinary. What he does is to take an ordinary object and gives you the illusion of it being a photograph, and you can stare at it for hours trying to work out what is going on. And here, there's something slightly different. It's obvious that this is not a photograph because it's too distorted, but it is obviously realist in the sense that this is figurative. It's very painterly. It's very expertly done in the sense that this is somebody who probably would disagree with the quotation that Christine read out from Sieg about the fact that the brushstrokes are more important than the result. Here, for Richter, the brushstrokes are absolutely driven by a very deliberate and careful attempt to almost portray reality, but to give you a kind of sense that something is off and to leave you a little bit somehow quivering in response to what he's depicting. This is Józef Scheiner, the Polish non-Jewish survivor of Auschwitz and artist. This is completely different. This is a man who creates paintings using his thumbprints. So these are inmates, or what appear to be inmates of a concentration camp, created simply by using his thumb. And here we see something that is, on the one hand, both abstract and figurative, in a sense. There is, it's not realist, but there is an index. There is a relationship between the mark on the page and something in reality that we think it's referring to. Here we see, this is one of my favorites. Those of you who've been to the Jewish Museum in Berlin will be familiar with Menashe Kadishman's Shalechet, or Fallen Leaves, a collection of some, maybe even over 10,000, I can't remember exactly, but many thousands of these iron plates, all the same, but all different. And you can walk over them, though it's extremely uncomfortable doing so. And they are all, some bigger than others. One or two of them even look like they're smiling or laughing, although the majority of them do not. And for me, this is a kind of representation in object form of Josef Scheiner's thumbprints, in a way. It's the same sort of, or a bit like those of you who are familiar with Anthony Gormley's work. It's a similar kind of notion that all of these things are the same but different. This is, I think, a representation of genocide as such, a mass crime targeting individuals because they belong to a group, not because they are those individuals, but because they are members of a particular group. Others, I think, and this is interesting from the point of view of thinking about Sieg Maandag's work, is there are artists that clearly this is not realism, it's more like surrealism in a sense. There are figures in Sam Bach's work as well. Christine is an expert on Samuel Bach, so I won't say too much. But I think it's a body of work that uses many Jewish references, Jewish texts, Jewish religious images, and so on, in order to create something that evokes a lost world, a destroyed world, but also the power of memory, as not necessarily as a form of redemption, but as a form of at least recuperating something from the past. No, why is it going the wrong way? What's happening? Oh. Okay. Chaya Stoica is probably the most well-known Romani artist of the Holocaust. And here you see something that is, while certainly figurative, could hardly be described as realist either. Her paintings have a naive, childlike quality about them, which is, I think, reflects her age at the time. And this particular painting I also thought was interesting to use here because this was not Sieg's experience, but, for example, the film director Frank Diamant, who's probably well known here, was a child survivor of Belsen who was sent out of the camp on one of 3 trains that were sent out of Bergen-Belsen at the end of the war. And this encounter with, here you see with German troops sending them to Sobibor, but in my head it always looks like the encounter of the children at the moment of their liberation. I'm not trying to confuse anything here, but it's just Stoica has this way of portraying the people here, I think, getting onto the train, but it looks to me like a similar scene that's been depicted of the liberation period too. There are more recent generations of artists who've incorporated documents into their work. Shmuel Dresner, Kiefer's very famous. Where's the other one? Aaron Glusker. These are artists who've used documents and texts to produce something that references the Holocaust, but doesn't necessarily depict it explicitly. Boltanski and Kiefer are probably very well known. Kiefer's series of works refer very deliberately and directly to key moments of German history. This is the Führerskanzlei in Berlin. Boltanski is, I think, an interesting sort of Holocaust artist. He denies it, but the depictions of, in this case, Swiss school children is clearly set up in a way that speaks to the kind of memory culture of the 1980s and 90s and the attempts to depict, again, a bit like Kadishman, nameless, although not faceless in this case, children as a group, not just as individuals, but as a group, and that's what's so important. Okay. Oh, and finally, this another more recent one, which very obviously uses a deliberate reference to Auschwitz camp and others, all mixed up in various ways to reference the events of the past. So these are all of these things have in common, and this are just hang on, a couple more. Okay. On the realist end, or almost realist end, I just thought I'd say a little bit about the British war artists who were sent to Belsen at the end of the war. This is a depiction of the so-called human laundry, so the taking care, the relief of survivors after the war. This is one of the few paintings by a British war artist from before the end of the war, also figurative. And this, one of the favourites, I use it on the cover of one of my books, Alicia Melamed Adams' Two Frightened Children. Again, it's figurative, but it's by no means realist. It's also bordering on surreal. Now then, all of these are recognisable as Holocaust art. Sieg Maandag's work is not. I think what all of us have done is kind of interpret his work through his life to a greater or lesser extent. And so I don't want to simply repeat what everyone has said already, but just to say that I think in these few paintings, some of which will now be becoming very familiar, you'll see, you see what I think is going on. Oops, with the beautiful shirt, I think you see. It reminds me of Francis Bacon's paintings of Pope Velasquez, it's gone out of my head, Innocent, and others screaming. But here, I think what Sieg is articulating is the fact that we've talked about trauma, but I think what you see here is something that he's aware that something needs to be articulated, but that cannot be. And art is not, I think, for Sieg a form of therapy. It's a form of recognition that there is something that needs to be articulated, but that he's struggling to articulate it. Art is the way through which he gives expression to the fact that he cannot articulate what needs to be articulated. That, I think, is what's going on here. And so it's no surprise, I think, that he paints, as we already saw, this split personality. I interpret this also through Ferenczi and the confusion of tongues, is what Ferenczi calls it, between the adult and the child, and both of those existing in the same time, in the same person. And finally, I'm going to also end with this one that Christine ended with, because I think here, this is the clearest. This is not a Holocaust painting, right? It's not a painting of horror. It's not claiming to be about a death camp. It's not in any way referencing the Holocaust. But it's, I think, to call it a self-portrait and to have this speech bubble with nothing in it, with the crazy eyes. Actually, these look very much like... There's a very famous painting from after the war by, I think, David Seymour or him, of a girl, when asked to paint home, what home looked like for her. She'd just do loads of squiggles, and it's a really famous painting. And the squiggles look like Sieg Maandag's eyes here. And so I think this is the clearest expression of the fact that there is something that needs to be said, but that he can't say it. And in that sense, I think... Maandag deserves to be incorporated into the canon of Holocaust art at the same time as he, in a sense, remains aloof from it. Okay, thank you.
I think this one?
Oh, yeah. You picked the right one. one. Okay, so thank you all so much for your insightful talks. I don't think there was that much repetition actually at all. I think you all highlighted some very interesting and different aspects of Sieg Maandag's life and work. I want to give the audience some time to reflect on the talks and also maybe some time to formulate their questions, which is why I just wanted to ask a first question here to the panelists, or maybe more a statement or some thoughts to start this discussion off with. And that is about the fragility and the moral weight of privilege. You spoke about it a bit in your talk, Christine, and especially in the face of systematic violence and genocide. I think we can all see that privilege very much shaped the experience of Sieg Maandag. He had this protection through his father, who was a diamond worker, but at the same time, it was also a privilege that was beyond his control. Right? It was not something he actively chose for. So how should we think about this, write about this, or evaluate this without passing judgment? And you spoke indeed about these quotation marks all the time, but I was wondering how you all, if you all could reflect on this a bit more, and also maybe, Don, you know a bit more about how Sieg himself reflected on this. What were his inner conflicts, tensions, complexities in dealing, but also articulating his trauma in the aftermath of Bergen-Belsen, both in maybe personal talks, but also interviews, statements, letters. I don't know what kind of sources there are. So, yeah, you want to go first? Yeah.
Well, thank you all, and thank you, Loreen, for this great question. You might have seen me raising my eyebrows at Simon because I had Sieg's son, because I had this thought, wait, maybe he never spoke about this at all. But I wanted to read you this quote, which is the last quote in the book, and he says, it was an interview in 1995 that he gave with the Telegraph. I live in a world where war is still the order of the day. People are tortured and children misused. And though I am quite traumatized, this world is filled with traumatized people. Who am I to take the word suffer into my mouth? So I feel that Sieg said that. He answered the question just now better than I could. But as I was sitting here listening and appreciating the talks, I was thinking, what is it that we wish we would say in our talks that we hadn't said? And I was thinking about how in the film and in my conversations with Simon, I learned about how Sieg would ask the children, I don't know on how many occasions, to take food that was left over outside and bury it across the street. Did this happen several times, Simon? A couple of times. So this was to sort of remind folks of their privilege, his children. I bring it up because in my mind is something that's related to this, but also not, which is I don't think that Sieg Maandag had something to say that he could not say. I think it's the opposite. I think he could not stop saying what he had to say over and over again. And I think for him, what he experienced lived on every single day, and he connected it directly, like in this quote that I just gave you, to other experiences of persecution and human suffering. So when he says, who am I to take the word suffer into my own mouth, then he says something to speak to that situation. I wanted to say one more thing, which is I think Jerry Lockmacher's son is here. Am I correct about this? No. Okay. There's someone who looks like a survivor that we haven't mentioned, Jerry Lockmacher. He was one of the children. I just wanted to mention that I heard from him yesterday, and he said, I told him about this event, and he said, people don't really seem to remember, but I called Luke, who's the other survivor that I haven't mentioned, and we talked to each other yesterday about how important it is for us today to remember what happened back then because of what's happening now. He wasn't specific about what he was talking about, but I think this was Sieg's way, too, to think about what's happening now in relation to what happened then. So that's my perspective on that.
Thank you for that. I was thinking about that specific point and throughout all of the discussions. And I think one of the reasons that I came to that topic when Don invited us to reflect on Sieg's life and work was because in some ways it echoed the family and the reason for the institution that I represent, the Wiener Holocaust Library, is actually in existence. The reason that Alfred Wiener, who founded the Wiener Holocaust Library, as many of you know, has a connection to Amsterdam history as well. It was originally founded here in 1933 and then was forced to move to London. And his wife and children remained behind and were sent to Westerbork and eventually Bergen-Belsen. And they had, in some ways, a similar experience of exception to Sieg. And so I was always thinking about that in relation to the kind of sort of remarkable story of their survival. But then I came across an account where one of his daughters reflects on it specifically and how she sort of combines what she later understood about the transport. They had fake foreign passports and they were put on a kind of exceptional transport outside of Bergen-Belsen in January 1945 before the liberation. So different story from Sieg's, but how she sort of processed this idea that they were the exception. And I think for me, when I was thinking about Sieg, it's really about trying to not hierarchize in hindsight and to remember the fragility of that. As you said, that's why I use that word specifically, because it seemed, I just noticed these moments in his testimony where he was thinking, sort of seemed to be reflecting on what he'd learned since and then applying it and then rethinking and how it's a kind of exhortation for us to do the same, to sort of think from what was known then rather than constantly trying to, as historians or as scholars, trying to place hierarchies around experience. And that's really difficult to do because we can't really put ourselves back there. But those sort of voices and that kind of exhortation to do that, I think, is so important.
Yes. Well, when I hear the word privilege, does it work? Yeah. When I hear the word privilege, I immediately have to add a lie. It was all a lie. Those privileges, for the time it worked, and then they were revoked. So and in some cases, so the father of Hetty Werkendam, for instance, he was not a diamond worker at all. He was in textile, and someday there was a rumor that you could best be on the list of diamond workers. So he went to the commander or I don't know who and said, "I'm a diamond worker," and he was on the list. And he went to Sachsenhausen. He was one of the 6 survivors of the group of 160 diamond workers who went to Sachsenhausen. So he was lucky after all, but that had nothing to do with that privilege. And he could have died just as easy. And so the privilege, it's also a scam. And it's very important to keep realizing that.
Yeah, maybe it's also important to add here that the fact that we in the Netherlands had so many sort of exception lists, right? Lists of Jews who were privileged, right? Including the Diamond Group. There is tons of other examples. Has also been mentioned by scholars as one of the reasons why in the Netherlands as many as 75% of the Jews in the end were murdered, precisely because they perceived to be safe, right? And they did not go into hiding. They did not look for alternative ways to sort of escape persecution. So it's also maybe almost the exact opposite. Yeah. Did you still want to say something to this? Okay. Okay. I'm looking at the audience if there's already some questions here. Sure. How? Okay.
I have a question about a specific topic of the Holocaust, which has become quite recently very important in the debate in Holland, namely the return of the survivors. What happened when they came back? What happened to the family? What happened to Sieg and his mother? They got their home back? They got their possessions back? Were they
So-
financially compensated? Had they trouble with the authorities in Amsterdam? Is anything
Okay.
known about
So
the
first I want to
situation
point
of
out,
their return?
in your same row at the other end, we have Dinka Handias, who wrote the book Return, which was published in the early 90s, which I think is one of the first treatments of what happened to people when they came back from the camps, right? So here she is, and she'll be here to talk later, I hope, too. What specifically happened to Sieg is that once he got back to Amsterdam, I think I told you, well, let's go back one. They went to the house of a kind of aunt, he and his sister. And what happened there is that he and his sister were so sort of accustomed to the camp that they kept their shoes under their pillows and they hid food. And their aunt found this utterly barbaric. She found them so strange, these children, that she couldn't allow them to live in her house anymore. In addition to that, I think it was his sister spread baby powder all over, as kids will do, all over the house. And so when that happened, out they went. So Sieg ended up going into this hospital because of his typhus, and also he was emaciated. And his sister went to another place. I can't remember. Do you remember where she went? I can't remember. And then eventually they are back with their mom, and they're living for a while, not in their old apartment. I can't remember where they live, but in a small place in Amsterdam. And then they, because of all the trauma, they have to move out of Amsterdam. Sieg is too, disoriented, traumatized, really, and his sister too. So that's a sort of blunt, quick treatment of the issue. But I think you're so right to raise the question.
Yes, and the material circumstances were awful. The men had lost, if they came back, they had lost their businesses and they couldn't get it back easily. The homes were taken up by other people. And so that's one of the things that struck me in many testimonies, how the children say that the worst was yet to come, in a sense. So the struggling just to get a livelihood and, well, a decent place to stay and all. So it must have been pretty horrible. And the Hetty story, the Hetty Werkendam, she is one of the few exceptions. She says, well, my father had a business relation and he had a cloth and he set up a booming business in textile again. That is such a rare exception.
And maybe also really to come back indeed to this issue of post-war dealings with what Sieg experienced, and also his sister and his mom. Reading a bit on this story in particular, I feel like his art is also very much about Sieg's post-war search for the boy that he was sort of before the photograph was actually taken. Before what Lawrence Langer and you already referred to this called the afterdeath of the Holocaust. But in addition to this, maybe we should also reflect a bit on the fact that he had a childhood that was taken away from him, right? As well as his sister. I don't know, in one of the articles in the volume, it's really explicitly stated that in the absence of their mother, she takes sort of on the role of the comforting adult for them, or in Bergen-Belsen, where he did not have this parent around anymore. How do you think that he managed to deal with this through his art, and also to relate, Don, as you did, his work to other survivors who used arts to express their emotions and to deal with trauma, or as you said it, not really deal with trauma, but maybe more have their war stories recognized. And that ties maybe and also very well into this discussion between pure abstractions versus realist representation of the Holocaust. So how do you sort of reflect on this?
I'll say a couple of things about Sieg and his relationship to children in general, because I think it's related. And what I learned from Simon and Sarah is that their dad would often take them on Saturdays or Sundays for outings, and he liked to go to museums. And one of the things he would do is say, look, I remember you saying this, Simon, what do you see? What do you see? And he really wanted to hear what his children saw in the paintings. And I remember Sarah telling me that there was a big line of people once at an exhibition that they went to. It was Dolly, because of the conversations that transpired between father and daughter. And when the movie was being made, Sieg wanted to play himself. So this was a movie being made about his childhood experience, and he got into the bed as part of the film, and he was playing himself as a 5-year-old boy. And this so disturbed the producer of the movie that there ensued this battle about what the movie would be, because he thought it was preposterous. What I interpret that to be about is Sieg being very interested in the concept of the child still being with him and trying to keep the child alive or enliven the child even in the present moment. You might know that he sang Frank Sinatra songs at the Paradiso. And he was a very playful man. He was also a very troubled man. I think it's important to say that. His sister Henneke's family has more trauma in it in certain ways. I don't feel authorized to speak about that, but it's something that I have intuited and know about, and she's not living anymore. I think it's important to know that there are lots of parts of a story that don't get told, too. But the part about his child self and the loss of it, I think he was kind of refining it every day in a certain way, or trying.
Is this one working? I think one of the things that's so interesting about Sieg's work is that it covers so many genres, right? So there's surrealism and abstract expressionism and
the microphone, yeah.
Sorry. There are a lot. Oh, that's better. There are lots of different genres in Sieg Maandag's work. So you can see surrealism and abstract expressionism, naive art, and so on. And those to come back specifically to the question, I think that experimenting with form is also a kind of response to this question, because it's about trying to find a way that represents, in a way that you feel is adequate to the particular moment in time, the thing that you want to articulate. And those debates are related very clearly to other artists and to other... I think I'm not so familiar with art, but with Holocaust literature, for example, or... yes, literature probably is the best example. Film could also do it. The question of whether realism or surrealism or oblique references, talking about the Holocaust by not talking about it, George Perec, for example, those kind of approaches are all echoed in literature in the same way that you see them in Sieg Maandag's work. There's something else I wanted to say, but I've forgotten, so I'll come back to it.
Are there any other questions? Yes.
Yes, I have a question.
Maybe wait for the mic. Yeah.
I have a question. I'm thinking of the work of Nick Stargard. I don't know whether that's familiar with you. He wrote about children drawing and painting, mainly drawing, in the concentration camp. And I was wondering, when you all were talking in a different way about trauma and art being a way to live on and maybe address the trauma, but to a way of expressing the unexpressible, like Dan Stone said, what for me was more like paradoxical, because I think in the end the art is expression on a meta level. But I was wondering what to say about what can be said about it. The art that was made by children, the drawings at the moment. And then I was just thinking, are there examples of adults who already drew in the camp as a child and became also artists depicting their experiences and they're dealing with their trauma later?
Well, I think that if such artists were there, they didn't have any means to do art in the concentration camp. There was no paper or pencil available. So, yeah, Theresienstadt. Yeah, the Theresienstadt is. No, it was not a nice place. I can't do that.
this is not working. It's the kind of microphone I should have. It doesn't actually work. No, now it does. It's on. I think there's art to be discussed here, which we don't seem to be jumping at the chance. What I would say about Sieg is he had what I would call like an artist's imagination or cinematic imagination. So that scene that Bettina describes, where he's standing outside of the group of men who are literally fighting for food, and he sees this one man who's not fighting. He's standing back. He sees himself as that man, I think, in certain ways, or he wants to be that man. And what I see in that image is a man who is a child, who is an artist being made, right? Like he is standing there making a picture, and he says in the testimony, that picture remains in my mind, something like this. So these pictures lived in him, and then he made them into paintings, right? So that's really different from what you're talking about. I'm just reminded of Margaret. I think Margaret's actually not here anymore, but Margaret you are, but I just don't see you. There you are. Hi, Margaret. So Margaret's parents were both in Bergen-Belsen, and they were writing little notes to each other. So we know that was possible, but I don't know much about anything more than those little pieces of paper. Yeah, but such a rich territory, and thank you, Maktal.
Yeah, maybe also for my own, as a very short example, I see there's more questions now, but I, myself in my research, I'm looking at letters between partners, one of whom is interned, and I found letters of a Jewish man who was interned in Drancy in France, and he writes letters to his non-Jewish wife outside the camp, and he was an artist before the war, and every letter he writes, he paints something beautiful, and what he actually does is not necessarily draw life in the camp, which we always are sort of used to and we expect, but he tries to bring life outside back into the camp by drawing beautiful flowers, bouquets, things he can still think of, like from his imagination, but which are not inside the camp. So there's so much more also to it, more than only drawing sort of life in the camp or dealing with trauma. But I think you raised a very important point there. Yeah, there was a question over here.
I have no question.
Mm-hmm.
It's almost time, by the way.
Okay, yeah, so we have two more questions. And
apart from the intellectual explorations about his art and life, I like to tell you all that I met Sieg personally. He came to me short before his death, 2 years in succession, in the synagogue at Yom Kippur, in the Obrecht Shul, the Rav Aaron Schuster synagogue at the Jacob Obrecht Street. And I know who he was. I've seen this world press photograph with which this evening started. And I knew enough about him, but he didn't know me, but he came to me and he wanted to make contact, and he took me by my arm and wanted to give me a hand. And he was so full of what was the day about, Yom Kippur, atonement in English, the Day of Atonement. And he was very stable, very symmetric. That is a relation to his art, his self-portrait, which is shown now. He was very symmetric and very quiet, and he was full of energy for contact, for atonement with all the people in the shul maybe, or all the people in the world, and he took me, and he didn't know me, and why he took me, I can tell you, my dressing and so was something particular for the shul and for that high day in shul, but that's what happened, and I wanted to share with you.
Thank you so much.
And for the same sake, I can tell you it's now Friday, and we have a nice meeting here, but all the cruelties of Shoah is not such a nice moment to do it on the Friday afternoon.
Thank you for sharing that. So we have one last question. Yeah, I saw. There in the back, I think.
15 minutes late. But
Yeah. Okay. If it's very, very short.
short question.
All right. Thank you for all of your talks. Also, thank you for sharing that story just now. My question comes back to the idea of privilege and the relevance of bringing up privilege. In my daily life, I'm a provenance researcher, so I look into World War II cultural items and I try to locate them and look into ambiguous histories of ownership and maybe even potential restitutions. So my work is to, do some sort of healing by bringing back cultural goods. And there the whole question of privilege is very big because those cultural items that were saved were obviously from people that were maybe richer, and those who didn't have that many cultural goods or not seen as, valuable in terms of money or, that were just not saved, will never find their way back. But then my work, I don't see the relevance of privilege there because I think if I can only do one thing, then, like for just a little healing, then how can we think of privilege beyond the idea of, the paradigm of hierarchy? And how do you, because you said we break open this conversation now in terms of privilege, we never dare to talk about it. But I find it hard to think about how we could think about it in a relevant way and in our research. And maybe in terms of provenance research, that was my question. It's not a small one.
Well, yeah, it's a great question, and you're doing great work. And I think we have the American Imago volume up here, and Christine gave some of her talk from Imago, but that article that she wrote, I think is a beautiful article, and she refers to a whole bunch of others. So what you say is part of a much larger conversation. It's very important. Of course, we don't have time now. We're headed out to have a drink together, but these last couple of questions, I just want to recognize how important they are, how much they matter, and just to be so grateful to all of you for coming here and bringing your full selves with all of your questions to this event.
Yeah, that's a wonderful ending of it. So thank you, and we can continue the conversations over drinks, I guess.